Today is actually the 100-day mark for the Biden administration. And at least in this country, the first 100 days has been a benchmark of sorts for presidents for a long time, stretching nearly a century back to the first term of Franklin Roosevelt, who laid out a very ambitious 100-day plan in his first term in the midst of the Great Depression. For President Biden, the focus has necessarily, I suppose, been largely on domestic matters, but as I said a moment ago, much to review on the Asia front as well. Joining us to do that today, Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. He's also the Harold J. Newman Fellow, Distinguished Fellow in Geopolitics at the Asia Society Policy Institute, the author of 10 books, including the bestseller Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. Elizabeth Economy joins us, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and also senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her latest book, out soon, is The World According to China, looking at China's foreign policy ambitions and their impact on the international system. Liz Economy has written 3 other books about China, and she has, among other things, been cited as, quote, one of the 10 names that matter on China policy, unquote. And leading the conversation today, Kevin Rudd, who, as I'm sure all of you know, has been president and CEO of the Asia Society, actually for just a bit longer than Joe Biden has now been president of the United States. Kevin, I'm not sure you're counting, but we have it at about 120 days for you. Kevin Rudd also serves as president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and before joining us was Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia. And since we've been mentioning books, Kevin is the author of 2 memoirs, Not for the Faint-Hearted and The PM Years, as in Prime Minister. Thank you for joining us wherever you may be tonight or in the morning if you're in Asia. I turn things over now to Kevin Rudd. Kevin?
Good. Well, thank you very much, Tom Nagorski. And it's good to be with both Ian Bremmer, friend and colleague from Eurasia Group, and Liz Economy, who is, as Tom Nagorski just indicated, one of America's foremost experts on China, and certainly someone whose views I have come to respect and draw upon over the years. Those of you interested in Xi Jinping, her biography of Xi Jinping is really a must-read for those trying to make sense of contemporary China. But here we are, 100 days into Biden land, and good, bad, or indifferent, multiple measures. I should have welcomed Moose, who is Ian's dog in the back, by the way. Moose is Ian's senior consultant on domestic politics and basically provides a daily indicator of how he thinks the Biden administration at the fire hydrant outside. Is that right, Ian?
Pretty much.
Good.
Absolutely, yeah.
Good, got it. Anyway, 100 days in, it's been fast and furious. And apart from it being the mandatory time to take stock of the administration's success or otherwise so far, I think it's important we cover the terrain. So let's just start with pure politics pure and simple. Ian Bremmer, on a score of 1 to 10, 1 being catastrophic, 1 being catastrophic and 10 being brilliant, where are the politics, both the administration in the eyes of the American people, but also the navigation of the US Congress so far?
Yeah, well, first of all, wonderful to see both of you. This is the sort of thing that when you get the invitation, you can't say no because it's actually friends, it's not work. And I think everyone in the audience, if you're not already aware of that, you probably are. You will be made painfully so over the course of the hour. I think not just because the Trump administration had a pretty challenging first 100 days, but because I think that they have focused overwhelmingly on the domestic. They've needed to, given the scale and scope of the crisis, and they've been really effective. On the vaccine front, they over-delivered and they under-promised, and that's a smart thing to do. And I think that on the economy too, same. And the fact that you're talking about $6 trillion that is likely to get actually passed in total relief and support over the course of this year because they actually have a majority in the Senate, that's a staggering number. And it means the United States is doing a better job in economically responding to the crisis than any other G20 economy right now, in my view. Secondly, the United States is taking the lead on vaccine rollout compared to any other G20 economy. I mean, there are countries that are doing a better job. Israel, for example, it's 7 million people. It's New York City. There are no major economies. So you got to give Biden extraordinary credit. I mean, if it's not an A, it's close to an A. And I'm not saying that as a Democrat. You both know I don't have a party affiliation. I think he's doing a really good job domestically. And by the way, the one major domestic crisis he has that he can't do much about, he gave to his vice president, which is pretty smart, right? So it's not going to be his fault going forward. It's kind of like the way Trump, forced Pence to handle coronavirus as it was falling apart. It's time-honored tradition that you throw to your vice president the thing that you're going to get really screwed on. So, but on foreign policy, I fear that Biden is overpromising and underdelivering. And I'm obviously very interested in hearing what both of you think about that. Overpromising because he came out of the gate. And on foreign policy, what's the one thing Biden's been saying? America's back. We're back. The U.S. is back. Back to what? Back to the status quo ante? Are we being seen now as the way we were back in 2015? I would argue no. I mean, there's some things we were able to do immediately, like rejoin Paris Climate Accord and recommit to the World Health Organization, try to get back into the Iranian nuclear accord, the JCPOA. But I mean, if you look at the Anchorage meeting, that's not America's back, right? I mean, if you look at the way the Europeans perceive us right now and how much hedging is being done, in part because the power position of the U.S. vis-a-vis China is different today than it was 5 years ago. And in part because every one of our allies recognizes that Biden may be better than Trump, but they can come back. And we don't know how long the United States is going to continue to be ostensibly committed to multilateralism. And by the way, we're only sort of committed to multilateralism. On Afghanistan, we had an interagency process, and then we informed our allies who have more troops on the ground in Afghanistan, have lost more troops on the ground in Afghanistan, and are more committed to staying. But we decided we're pulling out. Oh, well, I mean, that's not multilateralism. And certainly in terms of near-term response on vaccine diplomacy, same thing. And I could even make the argument that on China, we're having a very smart, thoughtful interagency process that both of you are very, very engaged in. But it's not clear to me that we're trying to make our allies a part of that process. I think we're trying to figure out what we want the policy to be, and then we'll kind of tell our allies, okay, we figured it out, now we want you to get on board with us. That's not 100% true, but it's more than 50% true. And when you put all that together to where we are geopolitically, and I don't blame Biden for all of this, a lot of this is structural, a lot of this is because of Brexit, a lot of this is because Merkel's leaving the scene in Germany, a lot of this because Macron is more domestically challenged than he has been. And a number of other things with Russia in decline, really angry. I mean, we can Erdogan, a pain in the butt, not really an ally. But if you put it all together, at best, I give Biden like a B- on foreign policy. So 1 to 10, you asked. If it's a 1, 1.5, or excuse me, if it's a 10, 9.5 on domestic, maybe I'm an 7.5 on foreign policy, 7, but with pressure on the downside, with a feeling like there haven't been crises yet, but they're going to be. And it's not clear to me that this administration is going to handle them well.
So in summary, you're giving him A- on politics, A+ on the economy, B- on foreign policy.
I think that's right. And by the way, Moose is on board with all three of those.
Yeah, I noticed Moose, your ever faithful terrier back there, flinched when you began the critique on foreign policy. So I just want to note that for the record. Before I go to Liz, because I really want to see Liz's views about how the Chinese view the first 100 days of Biden. This will be important. And I might throw in some comments after she's spoken on that about how the rest of the world might be viewing the first 100 days of Biden. But isn't there a little factor here which we've skipped over quite quickly, which is, isn't it kind of neat to have a normal president in the eyes of the world? some person who's not on a rolling daily roller coaster ride of mood swings with a Twitter device at his left hand. And I think we are perhaps far too glibly factoring in the return to normality factor as if it's just a given that the closeness of the US presidential election outcome, it was nearly a not given. So I suppose what I'm saying, Ian, is that normal's not bad, is it?
No, and I mean, last night's speech, you may have seen that among people that saw it, 85% said that they thought it was a good speech. Part of the reason for that is because the ratings for last night's speech, 1/4 of what they were for Trump's State of the Union speeches. CNN down 50% in their ratings. That's a good thing. People watching less cable news, people caring less about politics and having it drive them insane, irrespective of what side they're on. On balance, that's a useful thing. But the reason I don't talk more about that is because, again, I think in terms of the perception around the world, very few people think it's going to last. I mean, Trumpism is very strong and dominant in the Republican Party, in my view. And certainly, even though those Republicans aren't getting the money from the corporates right now, Josh Hawley, Mike Pompeo, Tom Cotton, even DeSantis to a degree, they're raising record amounts from the grassroots. And same in Biden land. I mean, that Biden has been able to get the Democrats behind him fairly unified way, but there's no question that the moderates versus the woke wing of the Democratic Party, the woke wing is actually stronger and has the momentum. And so I think next November, when it's more likely than not that the Republicans take back the House, and suddenly we're back talking about 2024 and the election cycle, I think most American allies are going to hedge a lot more because they're not convinced that we are long for normalcy in this country. I'd like us to be longer for normalcy. I would like to see centrists on both sides trying to work together. I fear that is, of all of the advanced industrial democracies out there, I fear that the United States is not in pole position on that one.
Well, you've given us an important piece of information, which means that it's been a happy day at Mar-a-Lago. Joe Biden only got 1/4 of the television ratings of Donald Trump. So there'll be an upward mood swing down there, I'm sure, as a result of that nanobite of news. Now, Liz Economy, and not to let you off the hook on these questions, but let's do some reverse imaging of it. You're sitting around the table of the Standing Committee of the Politburo in Beijing. That's not possible because not only you're American, but you're a woman. So that's kind of rules that out. So let's put that on the table straight away. But secondly, if you were trying to, as it were, to use the Chinese term, 客观的分析, objective analysis of Biden's performance on the politics, the economy, and foreign policy for the first 100 days, before we get on to their performance on the US-China relationship, how do you think the Chinese are reading Biden's performance so far? Over to you, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Ian said, they're seeing this largely as a return to normalcy. I think they are probably fairly unhappy, not to veer already into the U.S.-China relationship part about this, but I think they were somewhat hopeful that in that return there would be a reset of the U.S.-China relationship, and that hasn't materialized. But I think they're looking and they're thinking, okay, this is a person who actually is taking a little bit of a longer term view. He's more forward looking on issues like climate change, certainly, than Donald Trump was. That could bode well for the U.S.-China relationship. We saw that, John Kerry traveled to Beijing already and seems to be a reasonable meeting with his counterpart, Xie Jinping. At the same time, Biden's also signaling that he's getting back into, as Ian was talking about, multilateral institutions. He held the climate summit. The Chinese were, they had to go, right? Because Xi Jinping has put himself out there as the leader on global climate change. But it's clear that he was reluctant to have the U.S. host this. It's like, for 4 years, basically, Xi Jinping had a free ride. He could let CO2 emissions go up and still portray himself as a leader on global climate change because Trump was, AWOL. So now you have Biden back. You have him setting out a pretty ambitious climate agenda. You've got a Congress that's enormously activated on China, a set of bills, the Strategic Competition Act. You've got endless frontiers on innovation. There's a lot going on that I think from Beijing's perspective doesn't bode well. And President Biden coming out and saying the U.S. is back, whether you want to, buy into that yet or not, I think is probably concerning to them. So I think to some extent for China, Biden could present the worst of both worlds, someone who's going to retain a tough position with regard to China, but at the same time, bring America back as sort of a leader, or try to bring America back, at least as a leader on the global stage, shore up the American economy, and put it forward into the 21st century in terms of innovation and clean energy and all those kinds of things. So I think that's how they'd see it. I think they'd like to focus on the kinds of things that Ian was talking about, the continued sort of presence of Donald Trump and the sort of grassroots, support for him and the divide. There's still a lot of talk, as about the polarized American society, and the Chinese are out there hammering all the time about the racial divide, the economic inequalities, and all the problems that are in the United States. So that gives them a lot of fodder for their media. But I think behind the scenes, I think there's probably more concern than not.
Yeah, that's kind of my baseline view of reading the Chinese media, but also speaking to Chinese think tanks, as I still do, in this crazy period of bifurcation and decoupling that we're partly experiencing, is that one fact point on the vaccination rollout in the United States. Many Chinese analysts that I've spoken to are surprised that it's gone, quote, well, unquote. It's not just the political expectation management that Ian referred to before. Any smart politician, unlike Trump, will always underpromise and overdeliver. And Biden, I think, has done that effectively. But peering beneath the surface of that, the rollout strategy actually has been operationally effective, which basically disputes the underlying Chinese analysis that you crazy Americans with your crazy democracy and your divided government, you finally got your comeuppance through dysfunctionality, and you can't actually even get basic governance tasks done, like managing a pandemic or rolling out a vaccine. Then whoopsie, the Americans got the vaccine right. So I think that's giving the regime pause for thought about some of the crazier advice they're getting, that the American system is down and out for the count. Then the second pause for thought is the one Ian touched on before, which is the pure economic data. And that is not only do you have the economy roaring back, but roaring back more rapidly and effectively than our Chinese friends necessarily anticipated. And the final, I think, surprise point among the Chinese, given their bewilderment at the way in which anyone could govern the United States, given divided government and the nature of Senate and House races held simultaneously with the presidential, is the fact that the narrative run domestically by the Chinese Communist Party that the United States is a house divided unto itself and therefore it can no longer stand. When you had the Georgia Senate outcome, against all the odds, delivering the Senate with a wafer-thin operating majority for the Democrats, the ability to punch through the two mega stimulus packages. So the Chinese at a level of politics are saying, my God, I think this crazy system they kind of made to work. And for those of us, Liz and I engage the Chinese all the time, I always say to them when they are at their most celebratory about American decline, these guys are a funny lot. That's you, the Americans, by the way. I said, the built-in stabilizers into that crazy system of theirs, they tend to kick in, and the truism about America reinventing itself and re-energizing itself for most adverse circumstances can come true. So lo and behold, I think in the first 100 days, my take is that they kind of look back and say, this lot have performed better on economics and politics than we thought that they could. And that deeply affects our view of their ability to exercise influence in the world, given that's where Marxist-Leninist analysis starts from, how you're going at home. I don't know if you agree with that as a,
No, I do agree. I mean, I think they're probably, beneath the surface, there's also recognition that the American vaccines are quite effective and more effective than the Chinese vaccines, right? So the rollout has been superior. And also we have, the most efficacious vaccines. I mean, to some extent, you would think they would also remember back to the global financial crisis, because you did see the same kind of air, and maybe a little bit, lower volume, but the air of triumphalism after the global financial crisis, and sort of belief that the United States was done, right? That this was the inflection point. The U.S. was always going to decline. China was always going to rise. It was just happening sooner than they thought. And then the economy rebounded in the United States, and China had to take a little bit of a step back. And I think to some extent, maybe that's what we're seeing again. But still, again, looking at the comments out of Yang Jiechi, out of Wang Yi, out of Xi Jinping himself, this whole narrative of the East is rising, the West is declining, and on and on. I think this is the narrative that they're going to continue to push.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up 2008, Liz, because I was thinking about it as Kevin was talking. I mean, the Chinese, I remember when they were saying, the US dollar is reserve currency. We're going to need the BRICS to come together and create an alternative, right? I mean, there was a lot of short-term Chinese triumphalism that made no sense at all and was very quickly put to bed as the US economy rebounded sharply, as we organized the G20 and took the lead and coordinated with allies and all of that kind of thing back in April 2009. I agree with you, Kevin, strongly that this time around, I mean, the rebound of the US economy is actually faster and sharper as of now than it was after 2008, which is quite something. And this is the latest data we're looking at. So that is, there's no question that if you're in Beijing right now, you are surprised with that. You're surprised on the vaccine front. But you have to, I mean, it just feels like such a different position. When I look at climate, and I saw Xi Jinping with that virtual meeting with the Germans and the French, like right before the Biden-led climate summit, there was nothing remotely like that going on after 2008. Not only would the Chinese not have tried it, but they wouldn't have been taken seriously. And now, I mean, if she's calling you up and you're the Europeans, you're taking that call. Like you have to. It's just a radically different position. On technology, same. The level of hedging going on for core American allies even is so much more significant and consequential than it was back in 2009. And so from that perspective, even though I agree that the US system is a lot more robust than a lot of America's adversaries would like to believe, and we're in a position where we can do a lot with that. I mean, we haven't done vaccine diplomacy yet, but with the Chinese vaccines not as good as they thought, the Russian vaccines actively problematic in manufacturing consistency. We just saw from Brazil, which was a really big hit, on top of Slovakia, and the Indians not being able to export anything anytime soon. The US is in a pretty unique position if we get our act together here. So there's no question that we can do better than 7.5 on the foreign policy side in the next 6, 12, 18 months. But I just think that China's starting position is radically different than where it was back in 2009, and they know it. And so for that's where I think the dynamic is different.
I would only point out, Ian, that you're right that Xi Jinping was able to have that meeting with Merkel and Macron on climate change, but the outcome of it was not enormously positive. What came out of it was basically the Europeans saying, get ready for a carbon border tax, and Xi Jinping saying, I have no interest in that, and everybody looking to Xi to do more, right? Or at very least, he's got, a reasonable target for 2060 of carbon neutrality, but no benchmarks on how to get there, a 14th five-year plan that didn't lay it out for people, lots of internal criticism from Chinese climate experts on that front. And so I think you're right, people are going to take his meetings, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to bow and scrape to whatever it is he says, putting Merkel aside, maybe. Yeah,
I would say that the active hedging on technology is going to be a hell of a lot greater than on climate. And on climate, it depends on who you are. But, take your point, the Europeans are, probably 65, 70% closer to us than they are to the Chinese in terms of who they want to work with. You talk to me about 5G, that starts looking a lot different.
Okay,
before we go down,
one more point of disagreement. I mean, actually, I think the Trump administration to give the devil its due, they did a pretty good job of alerting the world, starting with Australia. Let's note that Australia was actually—
I accept that. That's not disagreement. I accept that.
Actually pushed back, and a lot of European countries have now put Huawei out of their systems or are planning to. So, I mean, and some of them are doing it on technical grounds. You're right to the extent that they're trying to find excuses to do it, as opposed to saying, yeah, we're following the Americans, or yeah, we just don't like you very much, but they're doing it. And so, I'm not sure that the Chinese are all that when it comes to technology. I think this is going to be a big area for the Biden administration to push to try to find and to coordinate policy with the Europeans on technology and technology standards. And here, last point I'm going to make, sorry, Kevin, is, I thought it was fascinating that the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, has nominated an American to be the head of the International Telecommunication Union. Right? It'll be the first time in 50 years. Again, Trump, pulls us out of everything. They don't really care about the UN. And now we're putting somebody forward into one of the most important, standard setting bodies in the UN, technology standard setting bodies.
The final rejoinder to that, Liz, Biden's willingness and ability to execute on Made in America is a hell of a lot higher than Trump's. And that's actually playing out too at the same time. So this push and pull is not just international, it's also domestic.
Fair enough.
Let's, there are a couple of big drill downs we need to do in our next half hour. One is on, let's call it the entrails of US strategy towards China and Chinese strategy towards the United States. And the second is the impact and response of third countries. Ian's thesis about rolling hedging, even if the allies are being privately hedging rather than publicly hedging, but other non-allied third countries as well. So before we unpack both those two subjects, just a sidebar question to you, Liz, because it really interests me, and I think our audience as well. There's a slight debate in China about the effectiveness of their vaccines, about Sinopharm and Sinovac, and the two variations. Sinopharm, from memory, being the more effective one, Sinovac being the less effective one. Are you picking up anything in your analysis about how this debate is tracking within China itself? It's a forbidden and highly sensitive area, everything to do with the origins of the virus, the management of the virus, and the treatment of the virus through vaccines is regarded as a national secret for the Standing Committee of the Politburo only. But I think just at a clinical level, I think it's worth just reflecting on for a moment, particularly when measured against Moderna and Pfizer and where the American science has landed the United States. So any thoughts on that, Liz?
Yeah, I haven't seen much popular discussion. I think, I'm sure you saw when the head of the Chinese CDC came out and said that we need to do something to make them more effective. Maybe we'll mix them together or whatever. And then all of a sudden, you had this sort of retraction. He said, my comments were misinterpreted. That's not what I said at all. I didn't say that our vaccines weren't that effective. So clearly, as you say, it's a very sensitive issue. I also thought it was interesting, originally the Chinese said everybody has to get a Chinese vaccine if you want to come in. Like if you want to come into our country, you need to be vaccinated with a Chinese vaccine. Okay, then they pulled back that policy, which of course made no sense whatsoever. So I think, it's probably an area they prefer not to talk about. They still, as far as I know, haven't really put out very significant or transparent data on the efficacy of their vaccines. I mean, everything that we seem to read, for the most part, is coming from third countries.
And that's what's interesting.
Yeah.
Because you got a third country data source.
What's going on there, I don't know. So I think it's a really interesting question. And, as I think somebody said, we need a whistleblower in China for all of this stuff. I think, with regard to the vaccine.
I think we have a real sleeper question here, in my view, which is the efficacy of Chinese vaccines at home, particularly if their borders start to relax a little, and abroad in third countries where some of them may have been sold, shall we say, a pup. And pardon my ignorance here, Ian, but your Eurasia group does a lot of work in Latin America. Have the Brazilians been using the Chinese vaccine or not?
The Brazilians are using the Chinese vaccine. They had originally said they weren't going to, and then they backed that down. There's been, as you know, there's been a massive shake-up in cabinet And one of the biggest was that the foreign minister, who was one of the most zealous, sort of Trumpy, but also anti-Chinese, was taken out. And now you have, I think, a much more, if you want, balanced approach. But yeah, look, I think that the combination of the fact that a lot of these vaccines are particularly not as effective with the first jab, and that is particularly true of the Chinese vaccines, and the fact that the United States has not been able or willing to get out to India early when they needed our help, means that you're just getting a hell of a lot more cases out there. And in India, the cases, are probably 5 to 10x what we're actually seeing in terms of their inability to test and trace. And what that means, we have, again, our clients are in this space, or the big pharma companies as well. They think that at this point, by the end of the year, you're probably looking at base case 15 to 20 different variants out there. Which, and by the way, that doesn't mean more
globally, not just globally, in India.
Which doesn't mean more lethality, but it does mean a hell of a lot of transmission. It also means that you're not going to have just 1 or 2 boosters. You'll have 3 to 5 different boosters, and they're going to have to decide how many of the different types of boosters they manufacture and where they distribute it. And that it means it's going to be much harder and longer to respond to the pandemic. For a lot of these countries, it's not going to be 2021, 2022. It's going to be 2023, or maybe even permanent high-end flu problems. And I think the Chinese stand to lose a lot in the fact that they overpromised and have significantly underdelivered with a lot of countries out there.
I think there is a lot of room for a discrete research project by one of us at some stage soon on efficacy of the Chinese vaccine in third countries. Because I notice our Indian friends, apart from geopolitical reasons, are looking elsewhere. And Indian government officials I've spoken to also formed an analysis that the Sputnik vaccine from the Russians is actually more effective than the Chinese vaccine. So I don't know the answers to these questions, but I think given it's directly relevant to people's lives and recovery and everything else, it's a missing piece in our overall analytical equation. I said before we go to a dive into a couple of areas. One is what actually is happening in the entrails of Biden administration strategic work on China strategy. And then the flip side, what are the Chinese up to? And are we looking at a fundamental reset in Chinese strategic policy posture towards the US? So, Liz, do you want to kick off on the question of what you think the Bidenistas are up to on China strategy and where their process is up to, and in terms of continuity and change from, let's call it, the previous administration, beyond the headlines of strategic competition, where actually we will see substantive change. Liz, you first.
So I think what's been interesting is there really hasn't been a shift, I think, in the sort of threat perception from the Trump administration to the Biden administration around China. I think they both see China as the most significant challenge that the United States faces. Obviously, the administration has stayed with the Trump position on a number of very sensitive issues, like Xinjiang, like Hong Kong, like Taiwan. Inviting Bi-khim Xiao, the representative of Taiwan to the United States, to President Biden's inauguration, made quite a statement, as did, I think, Tony Blinken's calling what's going on in Xinjiang, the human rights abuses there, genocide, again, following up on former Secretary of State Pompeo's remarks to that effect. So I think there's been a continuity in those sort of discrete ways. And of course, the trade war. So we haven't seen any unwinding of the tariffs. And my understanding is that we're not going to see that immediately, that they're looking over the tariffs, trying to assess what's working, what's not. And I think here too, Secretary of Commerce has said, there's some things that have worked. And I think areas where Chinese products and US products competed head to head in the United States, washing machines, steel, you actually saw some jobs created or saved. Lots of other areas where that wasn't the case. Overall, of course, the US economy suffered as a result of the trade war. But I think all the departments are undertaking their own reviews of China policy. So that's going on right now. in terms of how the administration has changed its policy, I think the approach is radically different, right? This is an administration that has put, values front and center, the liberal international order, the rules-based order, which Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi said, they don't support. It's only supported by 12% of the world, which I find fascinating because then they say they support the UN-centered world. I'm thinking, isn't the rules-based order actually embedded in the UN, as far as I know? But in any case, we can discuss that issue later. I'd be interested in your comments. I think it pretty much is. I think most of the rules of the liberal international order are found in various conventions and other things within the UN. But so I think the values piece is huge. Obviously, the allies piece, you saw, where the administration situated the meeting with Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi and on the one hand and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan on the other, after President Biden's Quad summit, after the meetings, the 2-on-2 meetings in South Korea and Japan, then you had the meeting in Alaska with the Chinese. And then right from there, Tony Blinken flies off to Europe to meet with NATO and European allies. And so I think it reminds me a little bit of going back to the end stage of the Obama administration, which was really about situating China within the context of our allies, right? Not going for that G2 relationship, not saying this is the most important relationship that the United States has. It may be the relationship at some level that is most consequential globally, but it's not the one that we want to say is most important to us. So our allies matter. And I think that I see the allies, sort of effort here as maybe a little bit more than I think what Ian was suggesting. I actually think they've worked very hard to bring our allies on board. And I see this as a very multilateral administration. And I think Tony Blinken has said on numerous occasions that we're stronger with our allies, to the point that actually makes us sound a little bit weak when he keeps saying we have to operate from a position of strength. But I think front and center on the allies. And then finally, back again, we kind of talked about this, I think multilateral institutions and leading on the global, stage. So the climate summit wants to have a democracy summit, back into all the, organizations within the UN. So I think I see it, it's much more traditional, that sort of foreign policy. It's the US again, leading, but I think leading with a little bit more humility than previously, right? With an understanding that we can't do this alone. We can't really push back against China. Look in the Indo-Pacific. China has geographic advantage. Its military is growing. So that's how I see it. I think it's a similar threat perception, but a radically different approach diplomatically.
So I generally agree, with the orientation that you have here, Liz. I'm just a little bit more skeptical of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. I mean, it's certainly true that the United States is leading with more humility than they were under Trump. It would be inconceivable to lead with less humility, okay? But I don't think you find a lot of actual, honest-to-God multilateralists among American foreign policymakers. I think there are a lot of people that say they're multilateralists globally, but in reality, what multilateralism means is you figure out what you want to do. You don't embarrass your allies publicly, but you kind of expect that they're going to do what you want them to do because we're the United States and the rules-based order is the America-based order. And we've got a problem. And the problem is that the United States is by far the most powerful country in the world, but we're also the advanced industrial democracy that least follows the rules-based order, both domestically and internationally. And I want you to say that, right? That's what humility is. Humility is the fact that the US is more effective at promoting a lot of these policies because we're the biggest and we're the most powerful. But we'd be much better off if the Canadians or the Germans were the ones that were the most powerful, if what we want is that outcome, because they have much more moral capacity to be able to promote these policies. And I worry that the United States, even though we say, yes, we know that we have things we need to fix in the United States and we're humble, but no, actually the rules-based order is we have the right and you don't deserve to be at the table because you don't follow it. And I don't believe there's moral equivalence between the United States and China when it comes to human rights at home. When it comes to human rights abroad, that's a harder argument to make, right? I think, again, we can admit that. And certainly when it comes to following international law, it depends on your perspective to a great degree. So, and I think that the Chinese are very effective at exploiting the fact that we have lost a lot of that credibility, exploiting that with us directly and exploiting that with third countries. And I absolutely believe that the Biden people are trying to get our allies more on board. And I see that with the Quad, and I see it with the Europeans, I see it with the conversation with Trudeau, and they are having some success. They really are. But again, I want to be clear that this is not 2009. January 6th, we talked about Georgia and those 2 seats, and it matters because they get you the trillions of dollars. January 6th was a shock to allies, and people know it can happen again. And so this concept that the United States is back when we haven't fixed, it's been decades for the United States to become as politically dysfunctional and divided as we are. So I think maybe just to say one more thing, to take a step back, I think that it is important for us all to recognize the truth of the fact that the United States is by far the most dysfunctional, politically dysfunctional of the advanced industrial democracies. At the same time, that China is probably the most functional of the major authoritarian states. And that reality, given the fact that we're the 2 most powerful countries in the world, it's a fundamental geopolitical challenge that we are going to have to deal with for a generation. It's going to make it harder for us to get the right outcomes, the outcomes that I know all 3 of us on this call all want. Like we're very similar to our mission, but how we get there, I think we might have some nuanced differences.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say it's a really interesting way to frame it, and I want to think about it some more. But it's hard for me to agree that a lot of countries are looking at China as functional when they're forced to, imprison over 1 million of their own people in labor and re-education camps. That to me does not actually sound like a very functional governing structure. And they're, putting down their feminists, and they've got to send, inspection teams into their universities because they're afraid of any ideas that don't conform with their own idea. So I think we want to define functional as well, right? I know what you're saying. You're basically saying they're efficient and they get stuff done. But, the other part of this, Ian, is sometimes we're messier and everything we do is right out front and right in the media, right? And everything that China does is not right out front and not in the media. But I go back to that point about the climate change thing. U.S. emissions, we pulled out of Paris and still our emissions overall decreased, our CO2 emissions. China out there clamoring to be, Xi Jinping claim the mantle of climate leadership. Every year after 2017, as soon as we pull out, their emissions start going up. To me, that's not functional.
But I would argue different kind of leadership, massive amounts of investment into solar and wind and electric vehicles and supply chain. And if you want to be in charge in the post-carbon energy environment, the Chinese have taken a lead in a bunch of this stuff. And we will absolutely get our game on, and the private sector will be out in front. It'll be much more efficient. I'd like to ask you, actually, Liz, and I'm not trying to hijack this, Kevin, I promise, but I'm very interested in your thinking on this.
Kevin's off someplace else. He's finishing up his own book right now.
Do you think that that a majority of the Chinese, both the government as well as the people, and maybe the answer is different, domestically, do they think that they have largely solved the Xinjiang issue, the Uyghur issue?
I'd say probably yes.
So when I say that the Chinese are the most functional of authoritarian regimes, that's what I mean. And it's something I'm deeply unsettled by, but it doesn't make it less true.
Right.
If you look at all that, let me sort of take the warring states together here. Ian Bremmer in one corner, Lizzie Connor in the other. Let me do a call of the board. And by the way, Moose walked out on your speech, Ian, just before. So I just want
Oh my God, that's so wrong.
I just want to put that up there as a piece of evidence that you were doing okay there, and then Moosey thought it was just too far.
I gave him the border crisis. He's a border terrier. That's why.
One, where we're agreed is the threat perception of the Biden administration is similar, if not identical, to that of the Trump administration. I think that's agreed. Second, in terms of the differences in operational strategy, as I see it, and listening to both of you, they kind of fall into these categories. One, the Biden administration have fully imbibed the fact that the long-term effectiveness of American national strategy towards China and the world depends upon the domestic strength of the United States, and hence the centrality of the economic agenda for the administration. We may say that's just a truism, but it's actually important to note in the sequence, because that's how the Chinese view America, that its external power is a product of its domestic power. So that's one. Will the Americans succeed in re-engineering the domestic economy, and will they succeed in a new period of long-term sustainable economic growth? Open question, but not a bad start. Two, allies. Trump thought they were a bunch of schmucks. And frankly, all the playback I get from heads of government around the world, both in my hemisphere, East Asia, and in the European hemisphere, is much the same. He just regarded allies as a bunch of court jesters, and he was Henry Tudor, of course. And so this is a palpable shift in terms of respect, in terms of modesty given what's happened, and in terms of substantive engagement vis-a-vis concrete policy on China, on human rights, on technology in particular, and on, let's call it, global governance, which I'll come to in a minute. So that is, in my judgment, a palpable shift. Ian is right to throw in the caveat, which is, and so are we going to be dealing with Conan the Barbarian in 4 years' time, either himself or the son of Conan, in terms of a new MAGA-type administration, which again regards allies as a bunch of schmucks? Well, obviously, the allies, and they are by and large all Democratic allies, are mindful of that. But they see themselves as having no alternative but to work within the American script now with the Biden administration. And on balance, their view is wait and see, but with the view that Trumpianism, as manifest last time, may be unique, that it will come back in some form, but not in that particularly over-the-top form. So I think that's the second point about allies. But you're right about the caveat question. Caveat equals hedge equals let's think about it. That's why, in fact, the 24 election is just as important as the 20 election, vis-a-vis the way in which friends, adversaries, and foes of the United States actually view long-term American strategy. If it goes back to isolationism in 4 years' time, in a Trumpian sense, then you can almost kiss the show goodbye. And the third point that I'd make is in terms of where the administration goes on the substance of, let's call it, the trade, economic and technology agenda. And that, I think, is still up for grabs. I think it's fair to say the interagency review process is deeply underway, looking at all the tariff lines, look at the technology bans, and looking at, frankly, what may change or not change, even as far as visa categories for the future. And so I think this is the big question mark over which way they will go on tariffs and tech, and particularly, as you know, on microchips within tech. And the fourth point is, let's call it multilateralism. It's a term used, I think, with gay abandon in the United States, but let me give you an Australian definition of it, which is multilateral means everybody, 192 member states of the United Nations, who agree on a multilateral solution. That's what the United Nations is. And if you like, that's what the Bretton Woods institutions are, the bank, the fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, etc. Everything else is plurilateral, and including the alliance structures, which are almost minilateral, to be quite honest, given, and some of them are bilateral. The Asian alliances are all bilateral. NATO is plurilateral. So if you go to the multilateral order, which is the UN-based system and the Bretton Woods institutions, frankly, in the first 100 days, I was at a session of the UN Security Council a few days ago myself, giving expert evidence on an aspect before the Council. US ambassador there, she's performing marvelously well. Secondly, the candidatures by the United States for UN bodies like the ITU, that's new. The rejoining of Paris, that's new. And the fact that you're going to have a completely re-energized American aid bureaucracy once Samantha Power takes over, that's new. Do the Americans adhere to every element of, let's call it multilateral/international law? Of course not, because you've been the dominant global power. So the implied position is that you can, from time to time, cheat on the rules, which you did over Iraq when you invaded Iraq without the authorization of the UN Security Council. Didn't work out well, guys, either. But guess what? The rest of the countries in the world are not shocked and horrified by the fact that from time to time you stand outside the system because you are who you are. So if I go through that list of four, I think, overall, this is where I partly disagree with you, Ian. I'm more in Liz's camp. Not a bad outcome on foreign policy engagement for 100 days. And certainly our friends in Beijing are saying, these guys actually might really be back. That's a bit of a problem. We Chinese think we can still prevail, but this is not the lay-down misère that we once thought it was. Just before we go to questions in a few minutes' time, Ian, you spent a lot of time in Japan. You've got a significant Japanese business. I'm fascinated into the dynamics of America's principal allied relationship in the world, which is with Tokyo. I hate to say there's too many NATO people listening, but it actually is America's principal alliance in the world. That's with the Japanese. Japan's still the third largest economy in the world, and has a significant military force on the basis of still modest defense outlays. And the Chinese certainly do respect the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force in a way in which they don't respect any other force in the world other than the United States. So we've had Prime Minister Suga, all sorts of domestic trouble he's been in recently. He's been in Washington. Give me a sense of the current state and trajectory of US-Japan and Japan-China. And I think once we're through that, we might then flip into questions from our audience.
US-Japan about as strong as one could imagine, with the caveat that Suga has plenty of domestic challenges. They were obviously delighted to be the first government to be invited to the United States at the head of state level. Biden's ordering of meetings in terms of the first phone call with Trudeau and the first foreign minister with the Italians coming over, and then the first prime minister. It's all been very, very clearly delineated on who's important and why, and values and democracy and strategic importance and everything else. I mean, you really got to give them very high marks. It's not like Trump going to Saudi Arabia first, which was, was kind of insane, right? It's just a ridiculous thing to do. And I think
lots of gold.
Yeah, it didn't get him very far, right? I mean, when I think about the Suga meeting, I mean, it's true. One of the most substantive, by far, one of the most substantive announcements made in advance and for the Biden Earth Summit was from the Japanese and from Suga on carbon reduction trajectory over the coming decade, as well as on net zero. And they're moving forward on reducing international investment on the coal side as well. Furthermore, the Japanese have been very supportive of the Biden administration effort to have trilateral engagement with the South Koreans to try to fix that relationship. And that's, I think, of all of the outside the box things that the Biden administration has worked on so far, this is the one that is perhaps most meaningful, because you need the South Koreans and the Japanese working together. And that, of course, really wasn't the case through most of the Trump administration. So I think the Japanese are very comfortable, they're very happy. And even though the Japanese business community, the Keidanren, the Keizai Doyukai, have very significant investments in China that they do not want to suddenly pull up the spikes and leave, they also aligned very closely with the Japanese prime minister and with Modi. And when they say, here's what we're doing with the Americans, the Japanese business community is aligned with it. So I actually think, and that the joint announcement on Taiwan, the first time you've seen that since, I think, 1969, it didn't go quite as far as the Biden team wanted it to. It was a big deal for Japan. So, I mean, that relationship is at a 9.5 right now. It would be hard to improve very much from where it presently is.
Liz, a thought on Japan?
I agree with Ian, I think, and I was impressed with the Biden administration and just the political savviness of inviting the Japanese first, and starting off with the Quad. I mean, to be fair, I think the Asian partners, the relationships didn't fray as much under the Trump administration as the European relationships did. But I think this Biden team has a very strong Asia group in charge, I think, as you know, Kevin. And I think they're managing this beautifully in the Quad, and the sort of the substantive element that came out of the Quad partnership on the vaccine initiative. And if that actually turns out to work in a really impressive way, that's just a home run, right out of the gate. So no, I think it's looking very good.
Yeah, I think Kurt Campbell did actually well in his pre-visit to Tokyo. Ian is absolutely right. The Japanese would have died 1,000 deaths about the idea of a significant Taiwan reference in the joint statement. In fact, Ian, it was 1968. It's even worse than you suggested when they last referenced Taiwan.
I was off by a year, dude. Come on, that's not bad.
Yeah. No, I just want to keep.
So I'm impressed.
Yeah, I just want to keep you honest, Ian Bremmer. Just on your toes. I only found out yesterday, by the way, so I didn't. I'm not pretending to be super smart here. But I think that was a good piece of diplomacy, and by the United States. And I've got to say, more generally, the playback I'm getting from partners in Asia and partners in Europe is that it's the traditional sophistication of high-level American diplomacy that we've seen in the past under the Obama administration, under the Bush administration as well, by and large, and certainly with the Clinton administration. These are serious professionals who kind of know what they're doing. So let's go to some of the questions we've been getting from those who have been patiently engaging with our conversation so far. There are lots of questions for Moose here, by the way, Ian, if you could just take those on notice. One of the questions I've got here is about the... You're back?
I just put Moose up, so if you can ask him questions.
Okay, that's good. He's back. Thank you. Yeah. So anything too difficult, Ian, if you could just defer to Moose. Yep. That's a question from Guofu Yang from Voice of America, actually. What message do you think President Biden sent out to Beijing with last night's speech? When President Biden laid out two plans, families plans and job plans, did he actually have China in mind? So what was the administration seeking to do? Seeking to do with the speech last night in terms of the global audience? I know it would have been primarily a domestic audience. And how do you think, Liz, the Chinese would have actually seen the speech last night as well? Ian?
I think he had the Chinese in mind insofar as he understands that talking about a $6 trillion.
You've gone a bit faint on us, mate. You need to be a bit louder.
Insofar as talking about a $6 trillion spend this year is contextualized as we cannot lose to the Chinese. We must invest in our industrial capacity because otherwise they will eat our lunch. I think he's thinking about China in that useful domestic political way. I don't think he's thinking about China so much in terms of the direct family plan. No, I mean, I think he's thinking, in other words, if China didn't exist, literally didn't exist, I think that most of the $6 trillion would look identical, right? I mean, this is a Democrat wish list, and they can do it through reconciliation. They don't need a single Republican vote, and they know it. I mean, there's a little bit in terms of, sort of we need better semiconductor capacity because we've been asleep at the switch and the Chinese are suddenly putting a lot of money in and we've got to do more. But generally, when you look across the board here, this is the United States has greater inequality than any other G7 country. We have Trumpism for a reason. We have Bernie Sanders for a reason. After 2008, Obama did a major bailout that was focused on banks and the automotive companies, and it didn't go very well in terms of popular resentment. In fact, it helped to create the Tea Party. It helped to create Trumpism. And so this is a lot of money going to people and going to services and even addressing things like structural racism and infrastructure, which I know sounds woke, but in reality, is it the New Deal didn't deal with it. We didn't put money in the hands of Black people. So white people could actually get education with free loans and could buy houses with cheap mortgages, and the Blacks couldn't. They were systematically left out. So Biden's addressing that. That really has almost nothing to do with China. And by the way, appropriately so in my view.
Liz, how the Chinese have read the speech last night?
I haven't actually seen much commentary from the Chinese, so I couldn't say except, I don't think they probably liked being singled out, in the speech by name, as opposed to, any other. This was a domestic policy speech, as Ian said, and so I think they don't appreciate, being the target, as they were during the Trump administration, sort of being set out all the time as sort of the chief challenge for the United States. I think they prefer not to occupy center stage in a speech like this. But I think they'll understand it, as a domestic policy speech, with the exception of the fact that, again, they were singled out.
A question from Betsy Cohen, our vice chairperson and a long-standing trustee of the Asia Society. Betsy asks, do you think Yang Jiechi's optimistic comments on the future of US-China today on the anniversary of ping-pong diplomacy is an optimistic sign that China's aggressive anti-US diplomacy may be starting to calm down? Liz, I'll go to you on first.
Okay, so I have to say I haven't seen his comments, so now I'm a little embarrassed. Have you read them?
Don't worry, I'm in this position all the time.
It would be interesting. I'd have to know exactly what he said to know whether this was actually a step forward, or some sort of shift, or a signal of a potential shift, because sometimes things can be 95% positive, but it's that 5% that actually tells you what they're really trying to say. So I'm afraid I can't make a good assessment of it. I can only say that I think everything we've seen coming out of Yang and Wang over the past, month or so, and Wang Yi just gave a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations last week that was very hard hitting, and again referenced the not subscribing to the rules-based order and the sense that China's not going to bend to the interests of the United States, and so I'd be surprised if within the space of a few days you were actually seeing a shift like this, but I'd have to see the comments. But maybe you read the speech, Kevin.
No, I only seen one piece of commentary on it. And so the bottom line is, I think the Chinese are double messaging, which is the hardline strategy towards the United States does not change in any degree. My response to Betsy's question is that the task of China's most senior diplomats, both Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, is to open up lines of dialogue to the extent that they can in order to provide as much insight for the central Chinese leadership on where the perfidious Americans are now going. And so I think that's kind of the script. Certainly the background briefing coming out of the Anchorage meeting was the level of Chinese concern about the continuation of, let's call it, strategic dialogue channels with the United States. And this, I think, is got two utilities within the Chinese system. One, to demonstrate to those in China who are nervous about the current adverse state of the US-China relationship that it's okay, we now have a dialogue mechanism back, though we never had one under Trump, at least for the last 3 or 4 years of the Trump administration, except for Light Eyes' channel. But secondly, it's also with a view to having some insight into where the administration might actually be going. So I think there's this double messaging about we want dialogue, we want engagement, we want discussion, and take the temperature down a bit. But I do not see anything that I have analysed producing a conclusion other than the Chinese are pursuing their own hardline approach and a hard-nosed approach to the Americans. I think that's how I would see it. A question for you, Ian, from someone called Xiao Luo. And the Hi Xiao Luo, ni hao. For Ian Bremmer, the top risks for 2021, according to Eurasia Group, are polarization, COVID, climate, and then US-China. Biden got high marks for his handling of COVID, climate, and so-so on China. What about his handling of the first risk, which is polarization?
He's trying. I mean, right after he won the election, he comes out and he says, look, there are people out there with Trump signs on their yards and, your neighbors, and go and talk to them. And he invited 10 Republicans to come into the Oval to talk about, I know that we're not going to get a lot of bipartisan stuff done, but if you'd like me to buy some of you off, there is money to be had. Could you join us and vote? I mean, Biden's someone that in 40 plus years in the Senate, he had a lot of these senators on the Republican side on his cell phone. And and he would talk to them routinely, and he likes that kind of politics. And you even saw it in the speech yesterday. There was a freshman Republican member of the House who came over to him talking about a policing reform bill, and it was a very engaged and pretty authentic bipartisan moment. So I think that I give Biden very high marks for trying to deal with polarization in the U.S. Second impeachment in the United States, which got just about as many votes as the first impeachment, right, from the Republican side. And Biden chose not to say anything. He chose not to take a public view on it. He had one. He wanted to stay above it. He wanted to be presidential. He wanted to have the ability to try to still engage with these people. The fact is that given the fact that any objective analyst of American first 100 days would be giving Biden very strong marks in where the U.S. is right now compared to 3 months ago. Anyone, right, from all around the world. And then look at how the foreign allies look at the U.S. And Biden's approval rating is 53%, which is low. And why it's higher than Trump, of course. But I mean, Reagan was 67 at this point, right? Why is that? And it's because no matter how much Biden does, the depth of polarization in this country, driven by factors that we don't need to get into in this conversation, but we can at some other time, are very, very deep and structural. So unfortunately, my response to the question is that even though he's trying hard and he's doing a lot of the right things, he's not going to succeed in the near term. He might succeed a bit in the long term because the trillions of dollars that he's going to be spending over 10 years implies a level of redistribution that can make a difference in communities that are both red and blue. The people that are going to benefit from that infrastructure support voted for Trump and voted for Biden. That's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah, I must have been looking at the polling data of the United States as a former political leader myself. Given that Joe Biden hasn't really put a step much wrong in the first 100 days outside the Mexican border controversy, which is always lethal ground for any centre-left party around the world. I'm surprised that his polling numbers are relatively low. And that does tend to point to what you've just observed as the hardwired nature, the baked-in nature of the partisan divide in the United States over the last 4 years plus. Liz, question for you from Hitesh Sharma. She asks, can we talk about the implications of US-China political conflicts on US businesses in China? Is it becoming harder and for US businesses already in China, or with aspirations to expand in China to isolate themselves anyway from this conflict? Your thoughts on that, Liz?
Yeah, I think actually US business continues to grow in China, and FDI continues to increase. And so I think there can be a particular difficulties. For example, what we've been seeing around the Olympics, and it's not a U.S. company in the case of H&M, but it could easily be a U.S. company, and the issue of sourcing from Xinjiang. And I think companies that are sponsoring the Olympics are quite concerned. I think as China rolls out its social credit system and applies it to multinationals, that could engender some problems. I think there are a lot of things coming down the pike that could be problematic for U.S. companies. But, China has been good about selectively opening, for example, this past year to the financial sector. We had Tesla now has a big operation in China. So they do enough to keep people, I think, excited and interested, even as a lot of other kinds of signaling on things like dual circulation may suggest that there will be problems. And I'll give you an example. We had Made in China 2025. So we know that it is in China's longer term plan to become much more technologically self-sufficient, so that they will control the manufacturing of components in a number of critical cutting edge areas of technology. So one of the things that also came out around the two sessions were some statements talking about how China should also become much more self-sufficient in areas like sports and entertainment and pharmaceuticals and cosmetics and many other areas. So to me, that signals all those, these are a lot of areas that are very lucrative for multinationals. Why do you need you have the NBA, you have the, Premier League from the UK. China can't compete at this point with either of those. And what the Chinese are saying, the government officials are saying, is we want to have our own homegrown, companies or industries that are, basically also the ones that are dominating within the Chinese economy and then become also global champions. So I think over time, it's not just going to be the technology sector that becomes much more sort of insular within China, but I think it's going to be other industries as well. And again, I think the idea now is to make the international community more dependent on China in terms of being deeply engaged in supply chains, but to make China less reliant on the global economy. So that I think is the sort of mix. But again, I think the story is, there are many different stories when it comes to the Chinese economy. And I also think it can be very industry specific.
You're right about the organizing principle. Liz and I are familiar with the 4-character phrase in Chinese, which is called zili gengsheng, which means self-reliance. Those of us who've been around for a while, we remember it from earlier periods in Chinese political history. And then it kind of went into abeyance for about 30 years. It would pop up every now and again in the Chinese political literature. But really since the trade war of 1920, you see zili gengsheng in terms of this phrase, national self-reliance, self-sufficiency, really entering into the mainstream space of the Chinese political discourse. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Liz?
It is fair to say. I would just point out, though, that when we're thinking about the issue of decoupling, I consider Made in China 2025 to be sort of the first salvo. I think it really did begin more with China than the United States, even though the Trump administration... That's
a really good point, because Made in China is 2025, is 2015 that it came out, as opposed to Trade War 2018-19. So, and certainly it's a reflection, I believe, of Xi Jinpingism, which is quite a different script. And so I thought you had quite an elegant summary at the end of that, Liz, in terms of let's call it the orthodoxy, which is to cause, this is my paraphrase in throwing in Xi Jinpingism, to cause the global economy to become progressively dependent on the Chinese economy, and global firms to be progressively dependent on the Chinese economy through what Xi Jinping calls the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy, but at the same time reducing China's dependency on the global economy. And that all ultimately is a function of scale and size of what China is. But the big caveat, which is attached to that, and I had a conversation with a global corporation yesterday about this very thing, is if they're serious about national self-sufficiency, does that begin to crowd out space, really, for what's traditionally been pretty open access to a whole bunch of, let's call it, product markets within China itself? And so that, I think, is a real geoeconomic and frankly plain business question to be asked for the future as well. Last question I've got here is from Anupam, who says, what do you think about the Quad? Is it for real? And what can it be mobilized to do? What is its real potential? I tend to agree with Liz's comments before. I'm a bit surprised positively by the fact that the first meeting of the Quad embraced, as it were, a non-strategic agenda up front in terms of vaccines, and actually sees itself as having a wider mandate. But Ian, you're a geopolitics man. Quad, where do you think it can take us? And I'll conclude with some comments from you, Liz.
Oh, look, I obviously think it's a good idea, but we have to recognize that India is in many ways the odd man out. I mean, it's an incredibly poor country. You want to talk about carbon and climate, and I mean, you know, the equity transfer requirements of the Indians to get to where we would want them to get on net zero is very, very difficult to get to. On basic democracy, they are seriously challenged, and they're going to get much more challenged because Modi his popularity will decrease, and he's going to have a real problem in places like West Bengal and next year on the back of having mishandled this coronavirus, declaring victory back in January, and now with, you know, the healthcare system across the country getting overwhelmed, while they were exporting vaccines, by the way. And all of that, I think, will move him towards more Hindu nationalism, and doing the kinds of things that will not stand him well with folks like Tony Blinken, focus more on human rights. Now, we can subvert our human rights perspective to a degree when it has strategic importance, but not completely, and especially not with this group. I also think that for India, you know, it's not like Japan, where the industrial community is going to follow. The industrial community in India mostly thinks it's a mistake for them not to be in RCEP. They think it's a mistake for them not to be in Belt and Road. You know, they see the main problem as not China. They see the main problem as Pakistan, and that China's in Pakistan largely for commercial reasons, not for military or political reasons. And so it's very important that the Indian government doesn't start playing geopolitics in a way that will undermine Indian business interests long term. Let's also keep in mind the fact that Modi is pretty strongly pro-business. He's not pro-trade at all. He's actually one of the more protectionist leaders out there. So I think the ability to really deepen US-India relations long-term, for many reasons, is going to be very constrained. There's a big opportunity right now because India's got a lot of problems, because we can help, and because India-China relations have been very tense on a bunch of issues, not least of which, you know, the Himalaya border problem. But if you ask me, you know, when I think about the Quad, I think about creating something that's going to be strategically important in 5 and 10 and 20 years. I think India will not integrate nearly as well as the rest of the Quad will in terms of strategic alignment.
There's some final thoughts from you, and let me add a twist to the question. Where do you think the Quad will go, and how seriously do you think the Chinese take it?
Well, I think the Chinese, let me start with the end, they're very unhappy with it. I mean, and you've seen all the statements that come out of various Chinese leaders about alliances, and they see them all as targeted against China. And I think most of them were not, but this one in some ways really, you know, is a lot about China. And I think in terms of India, you know, there's one of the U.S. officials that we all know well said the greatest surprise between the Obama administration, coming out of the Obama administration and now coming back in as part of the Biden administration, is just the extraordinary enthusiasm of Modi for the Quad. That in fact, he was the most enthusiastic in the meeting. And it may be a function, of that border conflict, of the fact that, India feels as though China is increasingly encroaching in its backyard and, very concerned about these things. So I think there is a very strong geostrategic rationale at this point in time for India to cement its engagement in the Quad in a way that was probably different from, 4 years ago. But you could be right. I mean, I don't know about the strength of the Indian business community and the weight that it might, put on the Indian government to keep, relations and ties open. I mean, my understanding was that actually in Sino-Indian trade and Indian exports to China are quite low. And so maybe it's a function of wanting to have more access to the Chinese economy. But I guess I see it as a pretty, as something that at least over the next 4 years, I think is likely to grow. And I think it's something that this Biden administration is going to cultivate. And I also think that, Japan and India have their own relationship too. So even as you have the Quad, you also have relations that are among the members of the Quad that I think will help to bolster it. And I think one of the things I'm interested in looking at in terms of just finishing up, Kevin, in response to your question is the extent to which we're getting the Europeans tied into the Quad now, and doing the military exercises like the French and, or sailing through the South China Sea or different kinds of permutations and having relations. I know the UK is interested in maybe having some kind of informal relationship with the Quad. So I think there are all sorts of different ways that are quite interesting in which this Quad might evolve, moving forward.
I think the Chinese baseline concern about the Quad will be if it does evolve in the direction of an effective quadrilateral alliance. That will be the trajectory that they fear most, with almost inbuilt mutual defence obligations. That is a way removed from what each national government could bear at this stage. Each government of the four have great bilateral relations with Washington. Some of them have good relations with each other. Australia has good relations, for example, with the other three. Japan and Korea goes without saying, few problems there. And then the Indians have a range of other hedging factors. Look at Modi's statement in the last 24 hours about his fantastic call with his best buddy, Vladimir Putin. And what a great chat that was. So the idea that this is kind of moving in some seamless direction is overstated. India will always have its own leverage points. But I think the baseline trajectory will be the NATOization of it over time. As we conclude, thank you for both your participation. I had a couple of questions, which I'm going to have a minute or two myself at answering, which is from Andrew and Michael Chi Kim asking about the attacks on Asian Americans at present right across the United States. So a word or two from me, and please contribute if you wish, Liz and Ian. We, the Asia Society, regard this as core business. We call the Asia Society for a reason, and that is we take not just the relationship in Asia and the United States seriously, but we take the contribution of Asian Americans seriously. And so as an institution, we have a very hard-line position on this, which is to stand in absolute solidarity with all Asian Americans who are experiencing either violence or the threats of violence on the streets of the United States at present. It's been a big increase in this over the last period of time. But we at the Asia Society are now running a comprehensive program, which we are calling Asian Americans Building America. It is standing against racism, but we're also highlighting centrally right across the country the extraordinary contribution which Asian Americans have made to the building of the Republic, from running neighborhood stores in Boise, Idaho, through to a 13-year-old girl I interviewed yesterday who's organized her own street rally against racism in San Francisco, through to a guy running an Indian restaurant in Los Angeles, through to a bunch of Asian graduates from West Point, Asian American graduates from West Point, through to the other outstanding examples in corporate America, philanthropic America, technology America, and Silicon Valley America. So you're going to hear a lot more from us as an institution on this in the period ahead, because we are at one in solidarity with our Asian American friends in confronting the despicable phenomenon of racism. So that's just my response to those couple of questions which have come in. I don't know, Liz or you and Ian wish to add before I close out. Good. Okay, listen, Liz, Ian, thank you so much for being with us for this. It's been a lot of fun. So but going back to the score sheet, Biden administration in the Ian lexicon, A- on politics, reaching out across the aisle, Congress being used effectively so far, low opinion poll ratings, but driven by the hard-baked-in polarization of American politics before. The economy, A+, booming back, bigger and better than most of the analysts predicted, and including within that, and on the back of that, a pretty successful vaccine rollout, because these things are axiomatically linked. And then some division among us in terms of the foreign policy scorecard. Liz and I being more generous, the hard teacher in the class, Ian being much less generous, and Moose remaining neutral on that latter question, I find. In fact, he's just moved from his chair and he's about to jump off again. I take that as his disagreement with my view that they've done well on foreign policy. So thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, Ian. And we look forward to joining all of our friends again from the Asia Society soon. See you again very soon. Bye.